Well, good afternoon. Welcome to another Conversation at the Table. I'm Chad Bresson. I am the lead church planter at the Table of Los Fresnos. So, how is your week going? How is the cabin fever coming along? I have a question. What have you done in the last 4 weeks that you wouldn't have done if you didn't have shelter in place? I know for some of us that's... I work in the yard, so I'm looking at my grass right now. Got some grub killer and laid down some seed. We've had a little bit of rain, so it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next couple of weeks. We're trying to get the grass to grow again. But doing anything special around the house? Something with the kids? Something with the family that you weren't doing before all of this started? I hope so. I hope you're making good use of the time that we've been given. That's a little differently, even though we are sheltering in place and even though we're all expecting to go back to normal. In fact, that seems to be the topic of the week right now, right? When do we get to go back to normal? As if normal is on the other side of what was 4 weeks ago, that we would be going back to normal. My guess is that life, even after COVID-19, is not going to be normal as we knew it. This really is a 9/11 event. But what do you think of the COVID-19 threat now? That's another thing that's being batted around. Everybody's got an opinion now that we're 4 weeks into it, saying, okay, this is how it's affected the RGV. Here's how it's affected my life in Los Fresnos. Here how it hasn't affected things. We all have an opinion as to whether or not we should, and the question of the day is, do we start to lift the restrictions and go back to work? All those things that I'm not being paid to make decisions for. We all have an opinion. Hey, Steve. Hey, Raphael. Glad you guys could be with us today. But it is interesting, that whole thing about whether or not we go back to work and when we go back to work and all these things. What happens after the most recent shelter-in-place order is lifted or expires? Competing voices. Who do we trust? Who do we believe? Because every time I start to think, oh, hey, that sounds like a really good idea. That sounds like we could run that road. All of a sudden, I hear another voice, and it's the complete opposite. And his voice sounds like it's to be believed. So we have competing voices. Now, whether we realize it or not, we have competing voices in our life all of the time. Now it's on like heightened alert. Now we got these competing voices and they're coming at us all at once. In fact, you've heard me and you've heard probably others say, if you start to feel overwhelmed, just shut it down. If all of these competing voices it becomes overwhelming, then it's time to shut it down. In fact, I would encourage you every day, take some time where you're actually moving away from the phone, moving away from the computer, moving away from the internet for your own health, and make it a regular habit. In other words, do it at the same time every day, and you'll find you're better off. We all need some rest from this. But because there's always competing voices, that actually shows up in the Easter account, the resurrection story that we looked at on Sunday in Matthew 28. And we're going to look at that just briefly right now as we think about these competing voices. We looked at Matthew's account on Sunday in Matthew 28. Matthew is giving us the story of the angel, the earthquake, the "he is not here, he is risen" statement, and then, of course, the risen Jesus appearing to his friends. And that's the story. Jesus is very much alive. And in fact, he runs into his friends on their way to go tell his disciples that he's alive. And he reiterates what the angel has said. Not only am I alive, go tell my friends that I'm alive and I'm going to be with you shortly. Go and tell my brothers the good news. Jesus is risen. That's the gospel, by the way. That's the gospel. That's the good news. Jesus is alive. Now, Jesus is alive. And as Matthew presents it, he's presenting it as fact. It's not simply another tale. It's not simply another story. This is a fact. Jesus is risen is a fact of history. And you'll hear this from time to time. I've already seen it, in the last few days, that the resurrection is a matter of faith. We need to believe it because it's a matter of faith. It is, but more importantly, Jesus is risen is a fact. It's what a theologian named Van Til said was a brute fact. He called it a brute fact, something that doesn't need interpretation. Voss said that the resurrection of all the events that have ever taken place in history is the one that really needs no interpretation. Now, the resurrection in the Bible does come with lots of interpretation, and it's very helpful for us. But if it could stand on its own, the resurrection's a fact of history. It literally happened. It's why we do what we do right now. Not only do we celebrate Easter, but we're right now here unpacking this on Facebook. But the disciples are to go and tell. The angel says, go and tell. Jesus says, go and tell. Go and tell this earth-shattering news that Jesus is risen. But that also comes with a competing voice. See, Matthew 28 begins with the resurrection story, and it has an angel and Jesus both saying, go and tell the good news, that it ends with Jesus and his disciples on a mountain where he's saying, go and make disciples, go and tell, and I will be with you always. But in between the resurrection and this mountain story is a competing voice. And that's what we're going to look at just briefly. There's a competing voice in this. There's always been a competing view. There's always been a competing voice bringing into question whether or not this is in fact true. Did Jesus really rise from the dead? You can hear echoes of what Eve heard in the garden. Did God really say, don't eat of the tree? Did Jesus really rise from the dead? And this is part of Matthew's story. Did Jesus really rise? Just as the angels and Jesus are saying, go and tell, then he also has another story. And tucked in between these two stories is this, Matthew 28, 11 through 15. Here's what Matthew 28 says, Matthew 28, 11. As they were on their way, some of the guards came into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. After the priests had assembled with the elders and agreed on a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money and told them, say this, his disciples came during the night and stole him while we were sleeping. If this reaches the governor's ears, we will deal with him and keep you out of trouble. They took the money and did as they were instructed. And this story has been spread among Jewish people to this day. Did Jesus really rise? Is there really good news? Did God really say? Do you hear the whispers of the serpent in the garden? Do you hear the competing voice? The alternate interpretation, one aimed at doubt and contradiction of the good news. Jesus didn't rise. Jesus didn't rise. The 11 disciples, Jesus' closest friends, we're going to say that they came and stole the body. And it's not just that the disciples stole the body. You're to say this. It's go and tell. Go and tell the disciples stole the body. You see what I'm saying? That's right here in Matthew. There is an alternative interpretation. There's something else that we can say. Instead of talking about the fact of the resurrection, we can talk about an alternative view. Something else. The disciples stole the body. And oh, by the way, go and tell. In fact, it says the story has been spread. You know, just like the gospel is spread in the book of Acts, here we see that the alternative view is spread as well. Jesus didn't rise. The disciples stole the body. There's always an alternative way of looking at the truth. It's called unbelief. And there's an alternate go and tell. There's an alternate message, one that denies that Jesus did in fact rise from the dead. It's an interesting reminder then here in Matthew that there's always a competing voice for our ears and our hearts. Always. Even during this pandemic, there are alternative voices. There are alternative voices that would have you doubt the good news that Jesus is risen from the dead. The good news that Jesus loves you. The good news that Jesus died for you. The good news that Jesus forgives you, no strings attached. In this pandemic, there are competing voices they're aimed at causing you to doubt that. They don't want you to believe that Jesus really does that for you and for me. In the inverse, what they want you to believe is you need to do this yourself. Trust yourself. Trust your gut. Trust your instincts. Save yourself. And then, of course, then that gives rise to all sorts of fears. Like, what if this and what if that? You see what happens when you start hearing these competing voices? You can start to feel like the world is ending tomorrow. Or the inverse, there's nothing to listen to. This really isn't happening, so let's just go back to our life as we know it. Competing voices all around us, causing us to doubt who we are in Jesus and what he has done for us. And what happens is these voices then take our focus off of Jesus. They want us to look at something other than Jesus and focus on that instead of having our faith and our trust in the one who has risen, the one who has died, and the one who has forgiven us. You see, we are resurrection people, living resurrected lives for Los Fresnos, for our neighbor. And some of it really is, like I said, the competing voices are very subtle. They're getting you to trust yourself, take your focus off of Jesus, and start believing in yourself and start listening to all these other things instead of Jesus. Instead of being reminded again and again that he died for us, he forgives us, he lives for us, and now we are resurrection people. It's very, very subtle. There is an alternative view that simply denies that Jesus rose from the dead, that Jesus isn't who he said he is. And so that's there as well, and that it's not a fact of history. It's not a brute fact that actually happened. That it's simply a matter of faith, and if Jesus rose for you. I've heard that. Jesus rose, well, he rose for you. Now you're making it sound like it didn't really happen, but if it happened in my head, then Jesus is risen. No, that's a fact of history. And again, competing voices out there are going to use this pandemic to make you think, or make you doubt, or make you place your trust someplace else other than Jesus, other than the risen Jesus. Because it becomes very easy for me to start to believe, you know what, Jesus doesn't really love me anymore. That happens. Competing voices. I can also begin to believe that Jesus is no longer in control, that he doesn't know what is going on, that he doesn't care, and my prayers aren't being answered, when they're not being answered the way I want them to be answered. And so there's just so many varied ways in which we begin to hear competing voices and begin believing something that isn't the truth. And when I decide, I know when that happens for me. I know that I'm not trusting Jesus is in control. I'm not believing Jesus to be who he is when I start trying to micromanage all sorts of things myself. When I start trying to control everything around me, when I'm trying to grab a hold of everything around me and to control the situation, when I am fearful of not being in control, that's when I know that I am not trusting Jesus. I'm not believing that he really has risen for me, and he really has forgiven me, and he really has died for me, and he has all this. He has me. That's how I know. So, when I begin to control or try to control stuff in my life that I can't control, that's when I need to stop. And I again need to come back to Matthew 28 and remind myself that Jesus is risen. He has risen for me. He has risen for you. He has forgiven you. No strings attached. And that's why I can remind myself over against all those competing voices, the ones that are saying, hey, he didn't really rise. He's not really in control. Know this, Jesus is risen. You are forgiven. You have his grace. He loves you. And that's all that matters. At the end of the day, that is all that matters. So rest in that tonight. This has been another conversation at the table. And if there's something you'd like to see us cover in one of these conversations, leave a comment here. Let me know what you'd like to see, what you'd like to hear. If you have any prayer requests, also leave that in the comment section or message me if you want it to remain private. Also, we have a Zoom Bible study, and the meeting ID will be right here on this Facebook page. We'll have that again this week. Thursday at noon is the time for the Bible study. We will post the meeting ID before that. There will also be another conversation at the table on Friday and Saturday. Then, of course, on Sunday, once again, we will stream our service live at 10:30 right here and on YouTube. So I pray all is well with you this evening. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay home, but stay connected. Remember, we're loved by Jesus for the love of Los Fresnos. Have a good evening.